So in the last lesson, we began with an overview of the Old Testament, and I wish to carry on from where we finished last time. It's worth first, though, reminding ourselves a little of why it's important to know about the Old Testament. First of all, the Old Testament teaches us about the events that lead up to the incarnation of Christ. And second, the Old Testament has much to teach us about our own spiritual life. The various people and events of the Old Testament of the nation of Israel itself can be understood as examples for us in our spiritual life, both by the good things and by the bad things they did. Once again, I especially recommend reading or hearing the Great Canon of St. Andrew of Crete during the first week of Lent, which is a great guide to us of how to read the Old Testament. We ended last time with how God gave a system of laws to Moses, which the people of Israel were instructed to follow. These laws included not only moral rules, most famously the Ten Commandments, but also rules governing all aspects of life, what food should be eaten, what clothes should be worn, and how the Israelites should farm and build their houses, and many other things. Those of you who read the 19th chapter of the book of Leviticus, which I recommended you last time to read, will especially appreciate this. These laws set the Israelites apart as a people dedicated to God, and are meant to remind them of their special covenant with God. The law also gave instructions on how God was to be worshipped. These included instructions for the construction of the tabernacle, the special tent which served the Israelites as a temple, which is pictured here. Here, God was worshipped primarily through animal sacrifice. Those of you who read the first chapter of Leviticus will understand. Forgive me. Those of you who read the first chapter of Leviticus will especially understand how this was done. These laws set the Israelites apart as a people dedicated. Those of you who the main wealth of the people consisted in their livestock. By expressing their worship to God by means of sacrifice, the Israelites are taught not to covet the things of the earth, but to think of all things as only of relative value in relation to God. We also spoke about the special vestments which the priests wore when they served in the tabernacle and what these symbolized. God had delivered the Israelites from slavery and called them to live a new way of life that was appropriate to their calling as God's chosen people. However, so many times during the life of Moses and the Israelites behaved in ways that were not worthy of the favor God had shown them. Almost straight away, the people began to fall into idolatry, worshipping created things in place of God. This was the kind of religion followed by most of the surrounding peoples, would therefore have seemed to the Israelites as a sensible path to follow. The worship of pagan gods promised an easy kind of religion. You could make an offering to the god of your choice and God will reward you with his earthly favor. On the other hand, the true God, while demanding a high morality from his people, did not seem to offer the same easy solutions which the pagan gods promised. The pagan gods, on the other hand, seem more the sort of beings that one could do business with in a worldly sense. Other Israelites complained to Moses, lost their faith in God, and claimed that life had been better as slaves in Egypt. It seemed better for them to go back to their certainties of slavery and to carry on living in the dangerous freedom God had given them. Again, when Moses sent spies in to visit the land of Canaan, to see what it was like, most of the spies complained that the people there were too strong and their cities too well defended. The people, with the exception of two, gave up the whole plan as hopeless folly. They'd been led out of Egypt for nothing. Because of the faithlessness of the Israelites, God told Moses that none of the adult population who left Egypt, with the exception of the two who remained faithful, would not be allowed to enter the promised land. The journey through the desert was prolonged for 40 years, during which time all but two who had left Egypt as adults died, and a whole new generation had grown up, who could not look back with longing to their old home in Egypt. Even Moses himself was not permitted to enter the promised land, but was only allowed a view of the land from the top of Mount Nebo, shortly before his death. Before dying, Moses gave his instructions to the Israelites, who were now finally ready to enter the promised land. These last instructions were contained in the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy meaning second law, since it was a summary of the law that had already been given previously. In Deuteronomy, God made it clear that Israel should not take his covenant for granted. The covenant depended on the Israelites remaining faithful to God. Moses speaks here, "It shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that the Lord thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come on thee, and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God. Blessed shalt thou be in the city, and blessed shalt thou be in the field." However, there was also the warning of the possibility of disobedience. And so Moses continues by saying, "It shall come to pass, if thou wilt not hearken unto the voice of the Lord thy God, to observe all his commandments and his statutes, which I commanded thee this day, that all these curses shall come upon thee and overtake thee. And the Lord shall scatter thee among the people, from the one end of the earth even unto the other. And thou shalt serve other gods, which neither thou nor thy fathers have known, even wood and stone. And among these nations shalt thou find no ease, neither shall the sole of thy foot have any rest. But the Lord shall give thee there a trembling heart, and failing eyes, and sorrow of mind." In the same speech, Moses also promised that God would raise another prophet, a greater prophet than him, who would come in the future. "The Lord thy God will raise up unto thee a prophet from the midst of thee, of thy brethren, like unto me. Unto him ye shall hearken." This prophet, of course, is a prophecy of the future Christ, who would be the fulfillment of the prophets. Moses died, and the leadership passed to a man named Joshua, the son of Nun, also known in Greek as Jesus, son of Navi, who had been the chief general of the Israelite army. He's one of the two who had remained faithful through the 40 years in the desert. Led by Joshua, the people of Israel crossed the river Jordan and captured the land of Canaan. The land was then divided between the 12 tribes. The tabernacle was set up at a place called Silo, which would become its permanent location for the next 250 years. Israel did not have a king like other nations. As it says in the book of Judges, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did that which was right in his own eyes. In fact, God himself was meant to be meant to be regarded as the king of Israel. However, other people took advantage of this, and there was therefore much lawlessness among the people during this period. The chief human rulers during this time were known as the judges. The judges were inspired, charismatic leaders who God would raise up to lead people during times of crisis. Famous judges included Gideon, Samson, and Deborah. This is a particularly violent period for Israel's history. As in the desert, the people constantly went astray, doing things that were evil and worshipping pagan gods. What would invariably follow the people's sin was the invasion by foreign nations. Then, just as all seemed lost, God would send a leader, such as Gideon, shown here in this picture, who would lead the people to repent and win the victory over their enemies. However, many of the judges were far from perfect themselves, and so would often lead the people back in their slide back into their old ways. The last judge was the prophet Samuel, a man who had grown up serving in the tabernacle since he was a child. During the time of Samuel's leadership, the people asked him to give them a king, so they might be like other nations. Samuel was upset by this proposal. This meant another rejection of God of God and are preferring of being safely subject to an earthly ruler in place of God. However, God consented to the people's wish and led Samuel to anoint as king a man named Saul from the tribe of Benjamin. Saul would begin his reign as a great military leader and brought stability to the new kingdom of Israel. However, soon he fell into the sin of disobedience, and for the person of the prophet Samuel, he was rejected by God. In place of Saul, God called Samuel to anoint as king a boy named David of the tribe of Judah, who lived in the town of Bethlehem. This boy would turn out to be the champion of Israel. When Israel was under threat from invasion by the Philistines, David is the only one who dared fight the Philistines' champion Goliath. On account of his miraculous victory over the Philistines, David entered the confidence of King Saul and grew to become a great general in the Israelite army. He would turn out to be an even greater leader than King Saul. This aroused the jealousy of Saul, who attempted to kill David. David spent some years as a fugitive, hiding in fear of his life, hiding among the hills. And yet, despite all that Saul tried to do to him, to harm him, David remained faithful in his loyalty to his king, even rejecting several attempts and opportunities to kill his enemy. Saul would eventually die by his own hand in despair after a defeat in battle. When David heard the news, he mourned for the dead king as for one well loved. David thus became king of Israel. As well as being a great king and military leader, David is also remembered as a poet. Most of the Psalms recorded in the Bible bear his name. David was not a perfect man. Indeed, the story is recorded of how he sent a man to his death in battle, in order that he might take the man's life as his own. However, after being reproved for this by the prophet Nathan, David made a deep and sincere repentance. King David's repentance is reflected in many of the Psalms, especially Psalm 50, a psalm used frequently by Orthodox Christians, both in church and as part of their private prayers. It was King David who made Jerusalem the capital of the Kingdom of Israel. Therefore, he had the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant moved from the silo to a new location in the city of Jerusalem. This is a map of the kingdom as it was in David's reign. With the city established, it became apparent to David that it was strange that while he and his people lived in houses made of stone, God was still worshipped in their tent. He therefore made plans for building a stone temple to replace the tabernacle. However, he was told by God through Nathan the prophet that because of the blood on his hands from his many battles, he was not the one who should build the tabernacle. Nevertheless, David did all he could to prepare for the building of the temple, gathering large quantities of stone, timber, gold, and other materials that would be needed. The building of the temple was begun around the year 950 BC by David's son Solomon, who succeeded him as king. The temple was on a larger scale than the tabernacle, but followed the same ground plan. It consisted of a courtyard where animals would be slaughtered in sacrifice, enclosing the temple itself, into which only the priests would enter. Like the tabernacle, the temple was divided by a curtain into two sections. The first was the holy place, where the priests would offer incense, present offerings of bread, and maintain a lampstand, which was kept burning at all times. Beyond the veil was the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was kept. Only the high priest would enter this place once a year on the Day of Atonement to sprinkle the sacrificial blood. The site of the temple was Mount Moriah, the hill upon which Abraham, all those years before, had attempted to sacrifice Isaac. King Solomon received from God the gift of wisdom. He is regarded as the author of most of the book of Proverbs, the book of Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Songs. However, Solomon unwisely drifted away from God. He took wives from among the pagan nations and began to worship their gods. Because of this, God sent the prophet Ahijah to declare to a man named Jeroboam that 10 of the tribes of Israel would be taken away from the family of King Solomon and be given to Jeroboam to rule as king. However, on account of Solomon's righteous father David, the fall of the kingdom was not to occur until after Solomon's death. When Solomon died, he was succeeded by his son Rehoboam. Rehoboam showed himself to be an unwise and cruel king. When Jeroboam began his rebellion against King Rehoboam, people flocked to his cause. Thus the kingdom of Israel was divided into two. The 10 northern tribes made Jeroboam their king. Rehoboam was left only the 2 southern tribes of Judah and Benjamin. The northern kingdom became known as Israel, while the southern kingdom was known as Judea, from which the people became known as the Jews. Soon after the division of the kingdom, the people began to follow the usual course of corrupting themselves with evil ways and idolatrous worship. King Jeroboam feared that if his people went south to worship in Jerusalem, they would turn against him and accept Rehoboam as their true king. Therefore, he decided to establish a new religion for his kingdom, having idols in the shape of calves made for which the people were instructed to worship as their gods. Added to this, the kingdom itself was unstable. Shortly after Jeroboam's death, his son was overthrown by an ambitious general. This story would repeat itself throughout the history of the Northern Kingdom. Selfish, unpopular kings were overthrown by ambitious but popular leaders. Upon taking power, would be just as wicked as the previous king, waiting for the day when their family would be overthrown by someone else. Things did not go much better in the kingdom of Judea. Like Solomon, many kings of Judea took foreign wives and foreign gods. Indeed, the Canaanite gods such as Baal, Moloch, and Astarte, who the Israelites worshipped, were particularly unpleasant. The preferred way in which these gods were worshipped was by means of temple prostitutes and the sacrifice of children. There were a few righteous kings who tried to turn back the tide on Judea's unfaithfulness, but of little lasting effect. It was especially during this period that God raised up the most famous of the prophets, including the prophets Elijah and Elijah, or Elias and Eliseus. These prophets spoke to the people from God's point of view, to reprove the people's sinful behavior and idolatry. They also predicted that what would come for Israel in the future. They predicted the eventual destruction of both kingdoms if they continued to resist God. However, they also looked forward to a coming Messiah, which means anointed one, who would save God's people. A prophet who spoke most clearly of the Messiah was the prophet Isaiah. In fact, the book of Isaiah is the most quoted Old Testament book in the New Testament. Isaiah speaks here of the coming Messiah. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there shall be no end, on the throne of David, and upon his kingdom, and ought to order it, and establish it with judgment and with justice, from henceforth even forever. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will perform this. However, the prophet Isaiah did not simply declare the Messiah to be a great deliverer, and great leader, and a glorious king, but also one who would save his people by humiliating death. Isaiah writes, "Surely he hath borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of God, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, he was bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed." Modern religious Jews who deny that Jesus Christ was the promised Messiah will deny that this passage refers to the Messiah. However, in fact, earlier Jewish commentaries who writed this passage do indeed refer to this as being about the Messiah, including the 12th century commentary by the Jewish scholar Moses Maimonides, who in fact lived long after the rise of Christianity. The warnings of the prophets began to come to pass in the year 734 BC, when the northern kingdom was invaded by the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrians were brutal towards conquered people, massacring vast numbers of civilians and deporting survivors to other parts of the empire. In order to subdue the land that had been the northern kingdom, the Assyrians settled foreign people in the land. These people eventually adopted a form of Judaism, but having their temple on Mount Gerizim in Samaria, rather than accepting the temple in Jerusalem. These people became known as the Samaritans, a religious group who still exist in the Middle East today. However, devout Israelites regarded them as with hostility, as heretics, and as people who had taken land that rightly belonged to Israel. The kingdom of Judea continued to exist for another 150 years. Although with only a few exceptions, both king and people continued to worship idols. The prophets continued to speak out, most famously the prophet Jeremiah. The book of Jeremiah is full of bitter words about the wickedness of the Judeans and dire warnings of what was about to come upon them as a consequence. But like Isaiah, Jeremiah also looks forward to a future age, beyond his own time, when God would put things right. In this passage, Jeremiah speaks of the future new covenant. Behold, the days come, saith the Lord, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and of the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers in the day that I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt, which my covenant they break, although I was an husband unto them, saith the Lord. For this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, saith the Lord, I'll put my law in their inward parts and write it on their hearts. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall teach no more every man his neighbour, every man his brother, saying, Know the Lord. For they shall all know me, the least of them unto the greatest of them, saith the Lord. I'll forgive their iniquity, and I'll remember their sin no more. This prophecy, of course, finally came to pass on the day of Pentecost, of the coming of the Holy Spirit, so that people should know God, not by simple knowledge itself, but by God, but by experience through the Holy Spirit. In 587 BC, Jerusalem was finally captured by the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonians had earlier defeated the Assyrians and established themselves as the dominant power in the Middle East. The temple in Jerusalem was razed to the ground and its treasures carried away for plunder. Almost the entire population of Judea was deported to exile in Babylon. The prophet Jeremiah wrote his famous lament for the fallen city in the book of Lamentations, in which he writes, How doth the city sit so solitary? How is she become a widow? She that was great among the nations, and princess among the provinces. How is she become tributary? She weepeth sore in the night, and her tears are on her cheeks. Among all her lovers she hath none to comfort her. All her friends have dealt treacherously with her. They become her enemies. Judah is gone into captivity because of affliction, and because of great servitude. She dwelleth among the heathen, she findeth no rest. All her persecutors overtook her between the straits. There's a beautiful custom in the Orthodox Western Rite in which passages from this book are read during the services of Holy Week, as the Church mourns for the living holy city, Jesus Christ. Psalm 136 also records the sadness of the Jews in exile. The rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and yea, we wept when we remembered Sion. This was the period of the prophet Daniel and the three holy children, who, despite all that happened to their people, remained faithful to God even in the face of bitter persecution. The Babylonian exile would only last about 70 years, but have a profound effect on the development of Judaism. Faced with the total collapse of their civilization and religion, the Jews began to seriously repent. In 539 BC, the Babylonian Empire fell to the rising Persian Empire. And then the following year, King Cyrus of Persia allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. Cyrus also returned to the Jews the treasures which had been taken from them, which had been kept in the royal treasury in Babylon. The rebuilding of the temple begins a new stage in Old Testament history, which scholars call the Second Temple period. This Second Temple was especially marked by a more serious attitude of the people towards keeping the law of Moses, and a more serious attempt to keep the people distinct from the surrounding nations. Intermarriage between Jews and Gentiles was strictly forbidden due to the corrupting influence this had had in the past. Yet still outward observance of the law could also be a cloak for no less grave sin. Another aspect of life new to this period was that now many Jews began to live outside the historic land of Israel. These Jews, known as diaspora Jews, developed new forms of Jewish worship that would have an impact on the development of later Christian worship. For those outside Israel, worship at the temple and participation in its rituals and sacrifices was impossible. Instead, Jews began to meet for worship in buildings known as synagogues, from the Greek as synagogue, meaning to gather together. Synagogue worship was based on readings from and study of the Holy Scriptures, together with prayers and singing of hymns. These houses of prayer and study became vital for the preservation of Jewish faith and identity. The worship was led not by priests, but by teachers known as rabbis. We shall say more about this next time. Israel managed to exist as a semi-independent province of the Persian Empire. This changed in the year 333 BC when the province was invaded by the Greek king Alexander the Great as part of his invasion of Persia. Indeed, Alexander would build the biggest empire that had been seen up to this point, his empire stretching from Greece to Egypt and across the length of Persia as far as India. The conquests of Alexander would leave a huge legacy for civilization. From this time until the rise of Islam and Arabic culture in the 7th century AD, Greek culture and language would be dominant of the Eastern Mediterranean world. When the church would begin in the 1st century AD, it would therefore emerge in a world united by the Greek language and Greek civilization. Alexander's empire came to an abrupt end in 323 BC when he died while on campaign at the age of 32. His empire was divided between his leading generals. The general Ptolemy established himself as Pharaoh of Egypt. Egypt has become a major center of Greek culture, with a vast library of ancient texts in the city of Alexandria. Alexandria would also have a large Jewish population. In the middle of the 3rd century BC, Ptolemy's son, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, asked for a translation to be made of the Jewish scriptures from Hebrew into Greek, so they might be included in the Library of Alexandria. The story goes that 70 rabbis were given the task of each making their own translation. When the 70 rabbis had completed their work and compared what they had produced, it was miraculously discovered that all the translations were exactly the same. This Greek translation became known as the Septuagint after the 70 rabbis. The Greek language was in fact becoming the dominant language of the growing Jewish diaspora around the Mediterranean. By the beginning of the 1st millennium AD, the Septuagint would be the version of the scriptures most known to most Jews. It was the version of the Old Testament still regarded as most authoritative in the Eastern Church. In the various places Jews settled, it also became quite common for pagans to convert to Judaism, leading to the creation of a Jewish culture which embraced what was best in Greek civilization. The 1st century BC Jewish philosopher Pharaoh of Alexandria a man well read both in Hebrew scriptures and in the Greek philosophers, is a good example of this meeting between Jews and Greeks. However, the other contacts between Jews and Greeks could be dangerous for the faith. The land of Syria was taken over by another Alexander's generals named Seleucus. This kingdom became known as the Seleucid Empire. Seleucus's great-great-great-grandson was King Antiochus IV Epiphanes. For some Jews, the Greek civilization of the Seleucid Empire proved very attractive, leading some particularly young Jewish men to embrace aspects of Greek culture, including Greek pagan gods. Soon King Antiochus was using force to compel the Jewish people to follow pagan customs and assimilate the Greek culture. Those who resisted were cruelly punished. Most shocking of all, Antiochus broke into the temple and defiled it with murder and pagan sacrifice. He even brazenly entered into the Holy of Holies, where he had statues of his gods set up. These actions of King Antiochus provoked a rebellion among faithful Jews under the leadership of a man named Judas Maccabeus and his brothers. The story of their struggle is told in the books of Maccabees. Judas Maccabeus recaptured the temple, purified it, and rededicated it. This event is celebrated in the Jewish feast of Hanukkah, the feast of dedication. The Maccabees succeeded in establishing an independent Jewish kingdom, known as the Hasmonean Kingdom. This kingdom again came to an end of the Roman invasion of 63 BC, led by the Roman general Pompey the Great. Like Antiochus before him, Pompey defiled the temple, slaughtering people in the sanctuary itself. As a final insult, he also, out of sheer curiosity, he entered into the Holy of Holies. Indeed, what was inside the Holy of Holies was a great topic of fabulous speculation amongst the ancient Greeks and Romans. He was actually surprised to find that it was empty. The Ark of the Covenant had disappeared some centuries before. According to the second book of Maccabees, before the fall of Jerusalem, the prophet Jeremiah hid the Ark in a cave on Mount Nebo, the hill from which Moses saw the promised land before his death. Though other traditions place it in Ethiopia or other places. Despite what Pompey did to the temple, he allowed it to be restored and for worship to be resumed. However, the price of the Jewish priests had to pay for the privilege of using the temple was to collaborate with their people's new overlords, something many devout Jews deeply resented. The Romans also allowed the Jews a semi-autonomous kingdom with their own king. The king the Romans chose, however, was King Herod, a Gentile Idumean who had converted to Judaism. Despite his conversion, many Jews regarded him as an impostor. Herod's propensity for cruelty also helped his unpopularity. In an attempt to win the Jews' favor, Herod offered to build a new and grander temple for them. The priests, however, delayed accepting this offer for several years before giving their final blessing for the project to begin. Herod is famed for his many large-scale building projects across his kingdom, which earned him the title Herod the Great. The rebuilding of the temple would take 70 years. Jesus Christ was born on earth shortly before the death of King Herod, about the year 1 BC. In fact, our dating system, which is meant to be based on the date of Christ's birth, is actually a few years out, is believed to be a few years out of date, a few years out. And so we can give a few years either way. The temple will be finished only 6 years before its final destruction. This period will be a time when devout Jews were divided into various factions. One of these factions was the Pharisees, who emphasized a strict observance of the law and had a special resentment for the Romans. An opposing faction were the Sadducees, who were more open to collaborating with the Romans, and also denied several points of Jewish traditional teaching, except held sacred by the Pharisees, including belief in angels and the resurrection of the dead. Another group of the Essenes, who believed the world had now become so corrupt. They withdrew to live in communes in the desert, close to the Dead Sea, where they prepared for what they believed would be the end of the world. It was the Essenes who produced a collection of Hebrew manuscripts known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in a number of caves near the Dead Sea in the 1950s. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain manuscripts of almost all but one of the Hebrew books of the Old Testament. The oldest versions to be preserved. Others are more extreme in their opposition to the Romans. These are known as the Zealots, who plotted a revolution that would overthrow the Romans and establish the Kingdom of Israel. The previous slide was a picture of what Herod's temple would have looked like when it was finished. This, of course, is the temple as it was at the time of Christ as well. In AD 66, a great Jewish revolt began against Roman rule. The Romans' response was predictably brutal. Huge numbers of rebels were massacred. Others were captured and sold as slaves. So many that it caused a massive drop in the value of slaves across the empire. When Jerusalem fell to the Romans about in AD 70, the temple was razed to the ground. This is just as the Lord had predicted 40 years before. Verily I say unto you, there shall not be left here one stone upon another, that shall not be thrown down. This is a detail from the Arch of Titus in Rome, which was built in celebration of the victory over the Jewish revolt, and shows the treasures of the temple being carried away as trophies of the war. The Islamic Dome of the Rock, built following the Muslim conquest of Jerusalem in 638 AD, now occupies the site of the temple in Jerusalem. One of the few substantial remains of the temple that remain today is a section of the Western Wall, now a place of pilgrimage for religious Jews. However, the Jews at this time had not yet given in to the Romans. In the year 136 AD, there was a second rebellion led by a Jew named Simon Bar Kokhba. The Bar Kokhba revolt was mercilessly crushed again. After the defeat, the rebels, the Emperor Hadrian forbade Jews from entering Jerusalem and gave the city a new Roman name, Aelia Capitolina. Following the failure of the two Jewish revolts, Judaism changed in a number of significant ways. The Jewish religion became more inward-looking, with its focus now on preserving the faith in a hostile world. Religion itself had to change in a number of ways as well. Without the temple, there could be no more sacrifices. Jewish scholars held countless debates on how Jewish law could be observed in the absence of the temple. And the fruits of these debates were then compiled into the collection of books known as the Talmud, a text which is the basis of modern religious Judaism. The Talmud was firm also in its rejection of Christ as the Messiah. Jewish followers of Christ were officially expelled from the synagogue around the year AD 85. You can see in this text of the Talmud, of course, you can see layers of the debates by the different sections of Hebrew text, which are commentaries of how to read and understand and apply the law in these new circumstances. At the same time, the church was growing. The understanding that it was the true continuation of the Old Testament and the new Israel. This new covenant was not one of exclusion, as had been but as had been foretold by the prophets, one to which all the peoples of the world are now welcomed, a light to enlighten the Gentiles and the glory of thy people Israel. And this new covenant will be the subject of our next lesson. So I'd like to finish there for now. And if there's any questions or comments,